Places and traditions in a small town often remain unchanged. Holiday celebrations reflect the essence of the season and the life of the community. Pleased to be part of the celebration of both, I joined the coffee club at Carlisle Drugstore, where the club meets regularly to reminisce about life in the small town. They, along with other individuals in the community, provide a living history. History is perhaps told best through stories that are passed down from generation to generation. These stories are part of a town's heritage that goes back to those days when there were only clearings in the pine thickets to mark civilization as the land's ownership passed from the Indian to the early settler. Told by local folk, the stories record the spirit of the town as well as the history. In 1955, the Horseshoe Bend National Military Park was established primarily through the efforts of Judge C.J. Coley and Thomas W. Martin, president of the Alabama Power Company. Judge Coley was often asked to tell the story of the passage of the land from the Indian to the white settler.
In the late 1700s, as you know, the United States was being established and people were coming in from foreign countries. And then later, in the early 1800s, the white men began to come down from the west and the east because these lands where we're sitting now were being sold at ridiculously low prices. Now, the Indians felt that this encroachment was unfair, and they began to resist it. But that didn't stop the movement of the white people coming in. And so actually, the Battle of Horseshoe Bend was a matter of the Indians defending their land and themselves and their ancestry, and the white man trying to get a new place and a new country.
With the encroachment of the white men into Indian country, tensions grew and led to the Battle of Horseshoe Bend.
In 1813, Andrew Jackson, who was just simply a border captain, he was not a man of any particular military status. He was a soldier, and the word got up to Tennessee to Governor Willie Blount that there had been major depredations down in what is now South Alabama. Actually, what happened was that the Indians, I believe it was in Washington County, that the Indians approached a fort down there where the men, women, and children were staying, and actually killed about 500 Americans. And Governor Willie Blount called Andrew Jackson, who was, as I said, a border captain, asked him to get his army together, and then he had the 39th Infantry, and they came down here. Now, Andrew Jackson came down here in the latter part of 1813, and he sent his scouts over here. He camped up about 5 miles from Horseshoe Bend and sent his scouts over here to see what the situation with the Indians was. Now, those scouts came back and told him, and David, the man that wore the hat, David, whatever his name was, came back and told him, says, you just can't attack that. Says, somebody had built those Indians great fortifications. It was the English, we think. And so Jackson went back, got more supplies, and came on March the 27th, 1814, and attacked this place right here. They bend in the Tallapoosa River.
In increasing numbers, the white settlers came down the Appalachian foothills of South Carolina and Georgia on horseback and wagon, traveling through creek fords and Indian trails into the territory known as Alabama. Bob Saxon, scholar and author, marks the transition of ownership of land from Indian to settler, when Indian villages were bordered by the scattered farms of a few hardy frontiersmen.
The settlers look at Indians as an obstacle. There was little contact between the average settler and the Indians. Now, they were individuals in the white community that traded with the Indians. Harrison Young, for example, who was the first sheriff of Tallapoosa County, very influential in state and local politics, moved back and forth. By this time, the white settlements were so close that you could live in both worlds without a great deal of inconvenience. And the real significance of Horseshoe Bend is this: it literally broke the military power of the Creeks. Up until that time, the Creeks were sovereign in their territory, which included virtually all of Alabama and most of Georgia. Militarily, they were in control. They were the dominant military factor in this area. After the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, they were a defeated people.
Though the Battle of Horseshoe Bend broke the strength of the Creek Nation, the final concessions and removal of Indians in the Alexander City and Tallapoosa area did not occur until the 1830s. White settlers arrived in increasing numbers, purchasing land at cheap prices and establishing homes in the old southwest frontier of central Alabama. Among the settlers was the large family of James Young, who with their belongings traveled from South Carolina into the area which would later become known as the town of Youngs or Youngville. Miss Jenny Lee Kelly, local lawyer and author, told the story of Young's entry into what is now the Alexander City area and the subsequent acquisition of land by the Young family.
The place was first called Georgia Trading Post, Georgia Store, and a man from Georgia came over to trade with the Indians and the Indians that were left, because we'd already had the Treaty of 1832. And so he set up a little store place out on the western part of town, somewhere along in the Russell Corporation business. And from there, I don't know, it wasn't very long, about 3 or 4 years that it was called that. And then the Youngs came.
James Young purchased 320 acres for $1.25 per acre, the established federal land price in 1837. Using the land as security, Young received a $1,000 loan from the Montgomery branch of the Bank of Alabama. James Young acquired the acreage for the town, but it was his son Griffin who laid off a portion of that land into business lots, establishing what is now known as the town square. In 1860, after learning that a railroad was being constructed that would extend from Georgia through central Alabama, Griffin promoted the development of Youngsville. A crowd of people gathered to watch the train pull into Youngsville. On the side of the engine was the name Simon Suggs. Inside, an engineer named John Fry. As Fry blew the whistle and steam popped through the safety valve, the people who had gathered to see the train's arrival scattered, fleeing for their lives from the iron monster.
Unless you've lived in a small town when the railroad is a big social affair, people would go down to, after the railroad came through, they'd go down what they call meet the train, to see who came in on it and who got on it to go off and what kind of freight was loaded off and on. And but the first train came through, it was called Simon Suggs. And it came one day, and people came from all the counties all around, and they sat, brought lunches and had picnics, and most of them had never seen a train, so it was big excitement, and it came through. And then after that, it was such a tremendous thing for the city, because now people could go east and west without having to go by horseback and buggies and that sort of thing.
Before and after the coming of the railroad, the Young family was instrumental in the economic development of the area. There have been members of the Young family in what is now known as Alexander City since the 1830s and 40s. Jerry Allen, a local banker and descendant of the settling family of Youngs, recalled growing up in the historic Fred Walker Young house. The home is listed on the Alabama Register of Landmarks and Heritage.
My mother was Von Seal Young, and she was from the Young family that helped settle this area back in the early 1830s. And it seems like there were 4 or 5 brothers that came into this area, Harrison Young, Bird Young, James Young, Griffin Young, and maybe I've left one out, but there were about 5 brothers that came here, and they did a variety of things. Some of them ran a general store, some of them were postmasters, some of them were farmers, but I am a descendant of that family of Youngs, as are a lot of other people in Ellick City and in this area. And my mother was always very conscious of that fact, and she was constantly talking about the early life for her in this county. She was born on what we say is Lake Martin now. She called it the river. She was born on the Tallapoosa River in 1910. And when she was 4 years old, she moved to a home on Cherokee Road, which is still standing and it still belongs to the family. And that home was originally 3 rooms, and they were log cabin. It was a log cabin. And of course, there's been rooms added to it, but we discovered the fact it was a log cabin back in the 50s. We didn't know it at that time. When some men were doing some work and they were cutting through one of the walls to make another room, and they burned up an electric saw trying to cut through some of the logs.
The fictional character of Simon Suggs appeared in the humorous sketches written by Johnson Jones Hooper in 1845. The stories about Simon Suggs were based on the real-life adventures of Bird Young.
Bird was also known as Simon Suggs, and he was one of the early brothers that came in here, and we talked about Harrison Young, Bird Young, James Young, Griffin Young, and Bird was one of those early groups that came in here. There were a lot of stories about him. Johnson Jones Hooper, as you know, I guess made him infamous. We won't say famous, we'll say infamous. And made him so famous in those days and times that my family, the early members of my family, went about the country buying the book and destroying it because there were so many stories in there that they didn't want told about Simon. Simon lived here in Alexander City, Alabama, and in Dadeville. There are many members of the family that could tell you stories about him, and I'll have to say the story that I'll tell came from Myrtle Young, who was a cousin of mine and a direct descendant of Simon Suggs or Bird Young. There's a story that goes about he wanted to have a camp meeting. They didn't call them revivals in those days, they called them camp meetings. So he was having this camp meeting, and he went about raising money to pay the expenses of the camp meeting. And he was a great storyteller and a great talker, which seems to be a characteristic of the family. And he collected a great deal of money. And the night before the camp meeting was to begin and the preacher came to town, Simon disappeared with all the money. And of course there was no camp meeting, and that was just one of the many examples of Simon Suggs.
In 1873, when the town was incorporated as Alexander City, it was still a frontier town in many ways. There was a pit for cockfighting, a distillery, 3 bar rooms, and a racetrack. There were also 3 stores, a doctor's office, a drugstore, a tannery, a blacksmith shop, and a wood shop. All were established near the railroad. Churches, the railroad, banks, and businesses became part of the tapestry of a growing town. Churches played an important role in the life of the early families, meeting social needs as well as spiritual. One of the earliest Methodist churches was established in 1835 at what is now Flint Hill. Another early church, a small log church known as Fellowship, was built as early as 1836. In the early churches such as Fellowship, the tradition of sacred harp singing was part of the worship service. On August 3, 1872, the Youngsville Baptist Church was organized with Reverend A.K. Tribble serving as its first minister. The beginnings of this church, as well as that of the First Methodist Church, was inspired by a bush arbor revival on Herzfeld Hill. The First Presbyterian Church was established in 1894. The Great Bethel Church was organized in 1880.
First one that I remember hearing about was a primitive Baptist church that was out west of town. It was about where Elizabeth Allison Elizabeth Russell Allison lived out where the Russell homes are out there. And then there was a church down around where the Coca-Cola plant is now, which was a church for black people, and they had a cemetery there and a little church. And I think that church was the one that was really the beginning of Reverend Nunn's church there. The church that was out, the Baptist church that was out west of town, they built a church there, and then when the logs began to sort of rot, they decided that they would build a new one, and they started looking for another place because the people from the east side of town that came out there to church had to pass by up where the Baptist church is now. They had a cockpit and a gambling thing, and people drank a lot, the men did, and cursed a lot, and so they didn't like to have to go by all that to get to their church out there. So they moved in and built a church in town. And then the Methodist and the Baptist churches that are now the First Methodist and the First Baptist got their start, I think it's about 1872 on this, where this property is here, this Herzfeld home. Before the Herzfeld home was built here, and there was a big tree out on the hill, and somebody says it's still there. I don't know which one it would be, and I don't know how anybody knows that for sure, but anyway, for a long time it was there. And the Baptists and the Methodists had there weren't any churches other than the ones I mentioned that I know about in town. So they met up here on under an arbor and had a revival and said they were going to build churches in town. So the Baptists were first, and the Methodists, organized the churches. So the Baptists organized first, and the Methodists about a year later organized, and out of those two things have come the Baptist church, and the Baptist church is right where it's been for ever since they started. And the Methodist church was on the corner where, as I said, Thomas Motors is, and then after the fire it moved down to where it is now, and it's been there ever since. The First Presbyterian Church was on the corner up there, what I was talking about, the same place, and it stayed there until they built their new church out to where it's not located now.
Some of the most interesting stories about the church services deal with some of the customs and traditions in the community, such as walking to church, all-day services and dinner on the grounds, recalled by Mrs. Ernestine Billups.
We walked to church, and we went to different churches every Sunday, and we never missed a Sunday. We lived approximately, my grandmother lived out, they called it Day Rockford Road at that particular time, where the Spring Hill projects are now. And that was the country, as they called it. And we would walk from there to Pearson Chapel Road, is approximately 10 to 12 to 15 miles. This was in the 50s, in the early 50s. I was 7 or 8. From my grandmother's house, I had my sister and brother, Mary Pearl and Edward, my Uncle Freddie, my Aunt Al, Aunt Betty, Aunt Mary Walls, Aunt Arlene, and the neighbors next door, who was Bud Goggins, and he had 5 children. Baptisms at Darien, Elam, I can't remember baptism at Elam number 1, but Darien we went to the branch, as they call it, the creek, and they would baptize there after the revival. They only baptized once a year. That would be during the third Sunday of August.
The churches attempted to keep people grounded in good moral principles and to preserve tradition. The railroad brought business, recreation, and change. The little town developed by the railroad as promised by Young, but not until the Civil War ended. A famous war general, E.P. Alexander, played such an important role in getting the railroad completed that the name of the town was changed from Youngsville to Alexander City as a tribute to him. The first train arrived on Wednesday, June 24, 1874. Local lawyer and banker Sim S. Wilbanks worked as vice president for the Southern Railway. He maintained an office in a boxcar traveling with the railroad to conduct business.
Due to the railroad moving in, that enlarged our town because we had ways to get in and out. And they made a great contribution. The city wanted to clean up and get rid of the depot that ran right down the middle of town. It was an eyesore. And we had a new president, and we talked him into moving the depot.
Alexander City grew up like most other small Alabama towns did around the railroad. The railroad came through from Opelika on to Talladega in 1874, and that's what really started the growth around Alex City. Hotels would grow up around, right around the railroad tracks, warehouses that would hold the freight for the railroads, and stores. And the streets in Alexander City really grew along that railroad track.
Around the railroad, businesses grew with the town. Enterprising families such as the Herzfelds, Frozens, Cohens, Lamberths, Graves, Dobbs, Reverend Nunn, and the Bulwares contributed to the town's economic growth. The first bank in Alexander City began in a corner of Herzfeld, Brother & Company, and was operated by Mr. Reuben Herzfeld.
The second bank in the county was organized in 1889 in Alex City by Mr. Reuben Herzfeld. And he was the first president, and then Mr. J.C. Maxwell was the second president. And I think it actually started in what we know as the old Frozens building now. At that point in time, it was Frozen Herzfeld, or Ralph might say Herzfeld and Frozen. But nevertheless, the bank grew and prospered till we see it now on the corner, and it's known as the South Trust Bank, of course. Mr. Maxwell has many relatives still living in Alex City today. Mr. Jake Henderson, the father of Jacob and Martha, and others, John Dillon, to name another one, and there's some others that I'm sure that we could all think of too. There have been other presidents of that bank. Mr. Harry Herzfeld was the third one. Mr. Leon Willis was the fourth one. Judge Coley was the fifth one. And Jimmy Ewan was the sixth one.
At the turn of the century, banking was done differently than it is done today. A rural economy drove the banking industry and shaped the ways of doing business for the banks.
The money at that point in time was used to make crops. And we had a lot of farming in this area. We had a little manufacturing, but we had more farming than anything else. And so the farmers borrowed money to make the crop. And that came out of the real purpose of banking, is to serve the needs of the community. And that was a need in the community at that time. People had no cash. They certainly didn't know how to write checks and didn't have checks. They dealt in cash, but they had very little of it, and they wouldn't have it about once or twice a year, and that was when they sold their crop and hopefully sold it for a profit and hopefully paid their debts and hopefully had a little left over. And interest on accounts probably didn't come into effect as we know it until maybe in the 1930s and the 1940s. Banks didn't have to pay for the use of the money. And of course, if you don't have to pay for the use of the money, you make a lot of money. And banks during that period of time were very successful without having to pay for the use of the funds. And today we have to pay for the use of our funds. And the money is for the same thing, to serve the needs of the community.
One of the needs of the community was to get the money in the hands of the public, and banks met this need.
Banks used to receive shipments of money from the federal government many years ago, before most of us were born. And it was back in the late 20s and the early 30s. And it would come in large sheets the size of a newspaper page. And it'd have the name of the bank on it. And there'd be a place for the president to sign, a place for the cashier to sign. And the president would sign his name, the cashier would sign his name. And then some clerk would take it and actually cut it with scissors. And that's the way the money got out into use in the public and in society.
Reuben Herzfeld, the town's first banker, came into Alexander City in 1874. He bought a great deal of land in the downtown area, including the Herzfeld Hill property, on which he built a house. The Reuben Herzfeld House is listed on the National Register of Historical Places. Chloe Mercer, representative of the Alabama Historical Commission, discussed the 2 buildings in Alexander City listed on the National Register.
2 buildings that are on the National Register in Alexander City include the Coley House and the Herzfeld House, and those are both located on Hillaby Street. The National Register is a listing of significant historic buildings that are usually 50 years or older. And this is really an honorary listing. It does not provide a great deal of protection except in some instances. But these buildings are listed because they are significant architecturally or because they are associated with an important person or event.
Reuben Herzfeld's granddaughter, Clara Ewing, told stories surrounding the history of the Herzfeld family.
My grandfather was Reuben Herzfeld, and he was born in the province of Hesse in a little town called Orelsen in Germany. And back in those days, they, when they got to be 21 years old, the Prussian army conscripted them into service. And I think that's why my grandfather came to this country. He was 19 years old when he migrated to this country. And he landed at Philadelphia. The boat he came in on came to Philadelphia. There was no Ellis Island then. That was in 1861. And at least that's what the census says. And so he then started rolling cigars in a cigar factory in New York City. He lived in the back of the factory. And he's very poor. And saved his money and finally bought enough merchandise to put on his back and peddled in Pennsylvania.
The routing of the railroad through Alexander City attracted Mr. Herzfeld to the town, where he and his brother Harry established Herzfeld Brother and Company. Here, customers could buy piece goods, work shoes, overalls, and staple provisions like meat, salt, sugar, flour, and green coffee. In the right-hand corner from the entrance of the store, an enclosure about 7 by 10 feet with a roll-top desk, a vault of stone with an iron door, and a burglar-proof safe marked the location of the town's first bank. In the 40-foot wide brick store, a customer could sell his cotton and purchase needed goods in return.
People brought their cotton in to him, and then he sold the cotton and kept their money for them and invested their money for them, and also they traded it out at the store. You know, he had a general mercantile store. And over in the corner of the store was his roll-top desk. We still have that. I gave it to my son, who's his great-great-grandson. And that's where the banks really started. And my father always told me, I never knew my grandfather. He died before my mother and father were even married, but he died in 1913 and with a heart attack here in this house. And my father always told me that grossfather said that the people just sort of forced him into the banking business. And Judge Coley has told me a story that his father wouldn't put, when they got a charter and chartered the bank, he went around and got different people in the community to subscribe so much money to start the bank, and it started with a $55,000 capital. And Mr. Coley, Jack's daddy, he told me this, that wouldn't put his money in the bank. And he still wanted my grandfather to keep the money like he'd always done. But that's how the bank started. And finally it got to be too big and too much. and because it started there in a corner of the store, and it got to be too much, and so he decided to sell his part of the business to his brother-in-law.
Reuben Herzfeld's son Harry married Jenny Martin in 1916, just before the beginning of World War I.
Well, my mother and father married in 1916, and my father went down and a little later on and tried to enlist in the service, and he didn't even tell my mother. And my mother said that she'd never been so horrified in her life when she found out that he'd done that. They didn't take him. They said he was more needed here. And the governor appointed him as the food administrator for Tallapoosa County. And so he was the food administrator. He was the one who had to be sure that everybody had their ration books and whatever else they had during World War I. And he found out, I don't know what he was doing in the attic or why he got up there, but my grandmother loved to can, and she canned all kinds of things. She had a big scupping on all out in the back, and she made wine too. And so she, of course, had to have sugar. So she had hoarded sugar and had hidden it in the attic. And I don't know how my daddy discovered it, but he was going to turn her in, and she would have had to have gone to jail or prison or something. I mean, something really bad was going to happen, because my mother threatened him with a divorce if he did turn her in, and that's the only thing that kept him from doing that. But he was a very meticulously honest person, and had lots of integrity that way. He wasn't even going to let his mother get by with hoarding.
The Reuben Herzfeld house, known as Mistletoe Bough, is now a bed and breakfast establishment. The house was purchased and restored by Carlos and Jean Payne in 1993.
We bought the house from the estate of Jenny Martin Herzfeld, who was actually the daughter-in-law of the man that had the house built. The gentleman that had the house built was Reuben Herzfeld, and his wife's name was Julia, and they came into the house with 4 sons and 1 daughter. The oldest son, who was Harry, inherited the house. He married a Jenny Martin Herzfeld. And when Mr. Harry passed away, the house was left to his wife, Miss Jenny. And the house was still in her name, in her estate. And we bought the house from her estate. I think because the house had only one owner, it has somehow or another just retained so much of the warmth. And I just feel like if Mr. Reuben and Miss Julia walked in this house today, that they would feel completely at home. The furnishings would be different. There would be a few different things, but he would know that he was at home.
Sharing a common history and kinship with the Herzfeld family, Ralph Frozen Jr. told the story of how his grandfather, Isaac Frozen, came into this country and became established in the general mercantile business.
Well, it's an interesting story. Both my grandfather and my grandmother on my father's side were born in Germany. They immigrated in the late 19th century as they were teenagers or in their 20s. My grandmother had some of her sisters had already come to this country and had settled in West Point, Georgia. When my grandfather, Isaac Frozen, came to this country, he came like a lot of the other immigrants. He landed in New York and went to Philadelphia. An interesting story upon his arrival. Of course, most of the immigrants came. They had to have connections in this country, but as he came over on the ship, he was almost penniless. The story is that he landed in this country with about 20 cents in American money, and he was so infatuated with, when he landed, seeing a fruit peddler selling bananas. He had never had the opportunity in Germany to experience what a banana tastes like, so he spent his 20 cents on 2 bananas.
he ate one and he put the other one in his pocket and without thinking sat down and squished his second banana. So that was his one of his interesting tales in entering this country. He soon after he landed in Philadelphia came to the South. He had family connections here, and he met my grandmother, I'm sure through family arrangements, and they were married and moved to Alexander City. He had a previous job with Wheel Brothers Cotton Brokers in Montgomery, and but a cousin, the Herzfelds, Reuben Herzfeld, had offered him a job to come be a partner in the Herzfeld Brothers mercantile business, and then in 1891 it became Herzfeld and Frozens.
Mr. Reuben Herzfeld hired his nephew Isaac Frozen to help with the store. When the bank outgrew its corner, Mr. Herzfeld opened the Alexander City Bank and sold his half interest in the store to Ike for $5,000 on credit. A description of a typical business day was provided by Ralph Frozen Sr. in his memoirs, I'm Still Here.
This was a time for Herzfelds to shine. The store opened at 6 in the morning, prepared to stay open until 11 or later at night. They sprinkled fresh sawdust over the floor around the pot-bellied stove so the clients would sit, talk, chew tobacco, and spit while sampling a jug of corn liquor. And while these farmers visited with their friends and neighbors, talked business, and learned the gossip, Ike Frozen stuck his best foot forward. To the sharecroppers, tenant farmers, and cotton growers, he showed new hats swathed in net and new neat hat pins, fine muslins, bleached domestics, corsets, and underwear, work boots, button shoes, and pointed toes that laced to the ankle. He displayed new furniture and tempted them with hard candy. Harvest time came and went. There were good years and depression years. A bale of cotton weighing 450 to 500 pounds might some years go for $30, and for some years just 4 cents a pound, and potatoes for 10 cents a bushel.
3 years after the business had become Herzfeld and Frozen, Marcus Herzfeld died suddenly. Mrs. Herzfeld sold her half interest to Ike, and the store became I. Frozen's. The building burned during the 1902 fire that destroyed the business sector of town.
Well, of course, that was the big thing in 1902. There were two things that happened in 1902, and that was the big one that involved so many people. Started down on what is now Main Street in one of the buildings behind not right on the street, but right behind, some kind of a foundry thing in Sparks. It was been a real dry year, and some of the sparks started a fire back there, and some of the people who were living at the time said that it was, they didn't think too much about it. It got to be about the size of a automobile, something, and they thought, well, you know, they'll have it out in a little while, but the wind blew and it spread and went all the way up that side of Main Street. The buildings were all wooden, and went up that side of Main Street and crossed over to where our law office is, Morris, Haynes, Ingram, Hornsby, right on the corner across from the courthouse. That's where the First Presbyterian Church was. So it went up to there, and one of the members of the church, one of the Coleys, I believe it was, got a little black boy to take a bucket and go up to the top of the church and pour some water on it and save the church. And then it went across to the courthouse and down the other side of Main Street and back behind that, and the street behind Main Street, and down the what is now Green Street to where Thomas Motors is. That used to be Wilbanks Motor Company, and that's where the Methodist church was at the time of the fire. And then it went up where the South Trust Bank is now. On the other side, where Piggly Wiggly is now, there was a hotel, and it burned the hotel and all that area in there. But the amazing thing about it was that by the I don't know, about the middle of the afternoon, I guess they had it all in control. But the very next day, some of the businesses started opening back up, and some of the doctors opened their offices, and so it wasn't too long until they had a lot of help from outside. The newspaper was burned in the office. It was burned, and the Opelika, I believe it was Opelika paper, called to let them know that they could use their presses, and so they didn't miss any issues of the newspaper. And things like that, all help from all around came, and it was just built back in less time than you'd think it would take, because the people were just so dedicated to overcoming that hardship.
The entire downtown business district was destroyed by the fire, with losses totaling $400,000. Business people such as the Frozens recuperated from their losses quickly and continued to expand their services to local people. Over the years, the Frozens established relationships with people like Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black, who recalled seeing his first train as he stood in front of the Frozen store.
Today I am sending you a recent publication about me entitled Hugo Black in the Supreme Court, a Symposium. Along with the book, I am sending a Xerox copy of a bill for goods purchased by my father, W.L. Black, from your predecessor store in Alexander City on August the 8th, 1888. My father evidently bought 2 school books at that time, along with leather, which he undoubtedly used in working on the family shoes. It was on that day, I am confident, that I stood in front of your store and watched the first train I ever saw running down the Central of Georgia railroad tracks.
W.D. Graves Sr. was an early businessman and politician in the Alexander City area. Grandson Preston Graves, who operates the furniture store in the old Masonic building on Main Street, has carried on the family business started by W.D. Graves Sr.
My grandfather, W.D. Graves Sr., he was born in Waverly, and my grandmother was born down there. They came to Alex City in around the late 1890s or the early 1900s, I'm not real sure at that time. My grandparents, the Nolans, were born here in Alex City, and they had a business which was across town over where David's Jewelry is now. My grandfather Graves had both of them had general merchandise stores here. My father took this business over after my grandfather, and then my wife and I, Bonnie and I, bought the business from my father 29 years ago. So we've had a business here the family has since the early 1900s, or certainly no later than teens. I'm not real sure about the dates on that, but the family has been in business here. My grandfather Graves was a member of the House of Representatives and Senate in the state down in Montgomery for 2 or 3 terms. I'm not sure how long he was down there, but he was always active in politics.
One of the businesses owned by the Graves family was the Strand Theater, opened in 1928 by Deacon Graves.
I'm not sure about the date that the Strand was built, but the original, and when I say the original, Mr. Ben Russell that's here in Alex City now, his grandfather and my grandfather built all the buildings going down on Tallapoosa and Alabama Street here, including the Strand Theater. And I can remember as a child, I lived about 3 blocks, but I used to walk up to the theater to come up to see the movies, and they'd come up on Saturday mornings. They would have the westerns and the serials, where it was a thing would go on every week, a continuous thing. But I can remember my entire life, and my children, we'd all walk up to the movie. It was very convenient for us. And but my grandfather and Mr. Russell built it and I think in the early
20s or the mid-20s, and they operated it, and it came a point in time when they were talking about showing movies on Sunday, and my grandfather did not approve of movies on Sunday or going out and doing things on Sunday, so he sold his half of the movie to Mr. Russell. I can remember coming to see Gone with the Wind, and let's see, that was probably in 40 or 41, and I was only 6, 7 years old, but they had, the thing I remember about it, and certainly being the movie that it was, but they had an intermission, and because the movie was so long, they let everybody get up and go outside and stretch and then come back and start the movie back. But I remember watching the movies as coming up here on Saturday morning to go to the movie. They had movies on Saturday morning and Saturday afternoon, and usually cowboy movies. And then back during World War II, they had a lot of patriotic type films.
Alexander City had its own hometown entertainment. During this time, Perry Mann was a local humorist of sorts.
The post office used to be over here where the Bud Porch Center is, and the story is, and I won't try to swear that this is truth, but it, like I said, it makes a good story. My grandmother came to town in her car and ran into Mr. Perry up there, a little fender bender, and she told him, said, Mr. Perry said, it's my fault, and if you'll just go have your car fixed and send the bill to my husband, said, we'll take care of it. And he said, no, ma'am, Miss Graves, said, it was my fault. I knew you were going to be in town this morning, and I ought to have more sense than to come over here to the post office. Down on the corner where Lou's barbershop is, it used to be Mitchell's barbershop. The Mitchell family is still here. Some of them are still here in town, but Mr. Perry used to sit in the window out there. They'd sit there and talk to everybody that came by, and a man stopped one day and from out of town, and he said, could you tell me where the Church of God is? And he stopped and thought a minute, and he said, well, let's see, Mr. Russell owns that church right back up there, and pointed toward the Baptist church, and he said, the Graves own the Methodist church, and said the Coleys own the Presbyterian church. He said, I don't believe God's got a church here in Ellick City. And another story that's a little off, but he had a sort of a little 7-Eleven type store, and there was a lady in town that she always felt she might be a cut above most of the folks, and she went in to see him one day and said, I'd like to get something for my husband different for supper tonight. And he said, well, I've got some calf's tongue over there. How about that? She said, I couldn't eat anything come out of an animal's mouth. And he said, well, how about some nice hen eggs then? And these are the type of stories that he had. They just went on forever. And I can remember seeing him up here as a child, and he went blind, not totally blind, but he got where he couldn't see, and they were talking to him about it, and he said, well, one nice thing about it, his best friend was Mr. Jimmy Lee White, Jim and Blake Schaffer's grandfather. And he said, well, one nice thing about being blind, I won't have to look at Jimmy Lee anymore. And that was the sense of humor he had.
Among the businesses that sprang up in the early years of the century was the Coca-Cola bottling plant, 8 short years after Coca-Cola made its debut in Atlanta. The popular drink was introduced in Alexander City by William Larkin Radney Sr. He came from Roanoke to start a Coca-Cola bottling company and was later joined by his brother, Thomas H. Radney.
Behind the creamery was the Knee High Bottling Company, owned and operated by M.Z. Waits, the father of Harry, Inez, Ann, and Betty. This was the most modern bottling plant in town until the Coca-Cola plant modernized by the middle 30s. I remember Mr. Waits had a bunch of premiums, such as knives with bottle openers, silverware, tea glasses, towels, etc. that could be purchased with a small amount of money and a certain number of knee-high bottle caps. At times, it was hard to find bottle caps around the stores that sold the knee-high drink. So many people were collecting them.
In 1926, Mr. Benjamin Russell purchased and moved to Alexander City a soil pipe company located in Anniston, Alabama. The soil pipe company was expanded and diversified and became Russell Pipe and Foundry Company. Thomas Russell was in charge of the foundry operations and was assisted by Joe Robinson Sr. The foundry was shut down during World War II because of lack of materials. Out of his work with ornamental iron at Russell Pipe and Foundry Company, Joe Robinson Sr. became intrigued with the artistic creations. When the Russell Pipe and Foundry Company was leased to out-of-town interest and was later sold to the lessees, Joe Robinson Sr. established the Robinson Foundry and Builders Supply Company in January of 1946. In 1973, Robinson Iron Corporation was founded with Joseph H. Robinson Sr., chairman of the board, Richard H. Robinson, president, and Joseph H. Robinson Jr., secretary-treasurer. Robinson Iron is internationally recognized for its replication and restoration of ornamental cast iron. Russell Pipe and Foundry Company continued to operate, with John F. Weathers serving as vice president until 1953 when the original structure burned. Luckily, the machine shop, pattern shop, and pattern storage areas were salvaged, and the main foundry building was rebuilt and completed in 1954, under the supervision of John F. Weathers, son of John C. Weathers. After the hardships of World War II, the commerce of the town began to recover. A variety of businesses developed along Bibb Street, as they did in the early days of the town. A cleaning and laundry business was established by Mr. John Boulware on Bibb Street in the 1960s. Mr. Boulware has been an outstanding leader in the community. He has served as a member of the Chamber of Commerce, a member of the Board of Directors of Schools, and in various leadership positions at Great Bethel Church.
But I was the only black cleaners down here. Back in the years, there once was one, but not in this spot. It was across the street. So this is the only one that has been in this spot, and this one was built for me, and I've been here ever since, which is 37 years. Well, we had 2 barber shops, and then we had a cafe, and then we had ice cream parlor and a taxi station. The taxi station was the People taxi station, and then the barber shop was most likely named up under the same name because Reverend nuns had this whole facility rented from the lady that owned this property.
Mr. Boulware attended school in the 1950s to prepare for his business.
We had GI school, and that was paid for through upon the Veteran Administration. So I attended school on that in chemistry, in mixing chemistry, and studying fabrons, and what they would take and what they wouldn't take for 2.5 years.
In the 1950s, Miss Jewel Barnes operated a beauty shop on Bibb Street in one of the buildings owned by Reverend Nunn.
My first beauty shop was located in one of his buildings, both across the street where the Bentons are and where John Boware's Cleaners is. That was the restaurant there. And the barber shop was beneath it. And I also had beauty shop in that building.
Bibb Street has been a thriving business area since the days when Reverend Nunn owned several businesses there. It was also the route of early parades in which the local schools participated.
The parades, the parades were wonderful. We would use the same area that we use now to go downtown, go around Carlisle Drugstore and come back around again and come back over here to the schools. The baseball games out on the baseball fields that are there now. The loud music, The laughter, the happiness that you could hear, the joy, which you still hear some of, thanks to the recreational department and Reverend Cooper and what they're doing here, and the others that are working under him. But I can remember, because I live right at the end of these fields, I can remember, I can almost hear now the gaiety, the laughter, the cheering, the jazz, I guess you call the honky-tonk music and all of that during those times, which you'll never forget if you ever really listen to. And I guess during the 50s, when you had the bobby socks and the long skirts and all that, that was all a part of that time.
Miss Coley taught for many years. Her grandfather was the principal of the Alexander City Colored School, and both her parents were teachers.
Started at the Alexander City Elementary School under L.L. Steele. Left there and went over and taught under Mr. Evans. After that time, Mr. Wagner, Richard Wagner, wonderful principals. Thank goodness I always loved the administrators that were in charge of the schools where I was. Didn't ever want to leave any of them, but through some way, Mr. Wagner encouraged me to go ahead and after I went back to school in counseling, to come on over and be a part of the middle school, where I've been now for the last 5 years as guidance counselor. Those have been wonderful years.
In 1879, a one-story school was completed on the hill where the Alexander City Middle School now stands. In 1887, Mr. J.D. Dixon and Mr. J.M. Pearson assumed control of the school. Dixon taught in the east end of the building and Pearson in the west end, with no partition between. Textbooks used by the 75 or 80 children in the school were donated and were not uniform. Students used slates and slate pencils in the high ceilinged room that was heated by open grates and stoves. Water was carried from a spring in the back of the building. Students paid tuition to support the school. The Alexander City High School building was started in 1908, completed in 1909, and accredited in 1910, consisting of grades 1 through 10. Russell Mills established Russell School in 1919, and in 1920 a school was provided for the children of Avondale Mill employees. J.W. Graves and Miss Roxy Dunaway were teachers in a resident building on Maple Street until 1924, when a modern brick building was erected near Avondale Mills. Mr. H.P. Stewart became the principal of the Alexander City Colored School in 1909.
In the year of 1919, moved to Alexander City and began going to school, what was known as the city school. The Professor Henry Powers Stewart was the principal.
A pot-bellied stove heated the three-room school in the winter.
And there were 3 rooms, 1 upstairs and 2 downstairs. And the teacher, one was Ms. Estelle Allen. She taught the middle class upstairs, and downstairs was Professor Stewart's wife, Estelle Stewart, and she taught the younger children, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade. And in the other room, Professor Stewart had the older, I'll say, boys and girls. And there were about 15 in our class. If you would like for me to name some of them, I will. And that was Elizabeth Ransall, Shelley Frank Maxwell, LaBelle Burns, Homer Moulton, and Wenda Moulton, Bessie Hodge Beasley, Inez Stewart, Willie Mae Isom, and Willie Mae White.
Mrs. Jewel Barnes fondly remembered some of her experiences under Professor W.T. Darnell Sr. at the Alexander City Colored School.
When I came here, I was 8 years old, and I started school under Professor W.J. Darnell Sr. And the teachers was as I can remember, was Mrs. Hallie Hopper, Mrs. Ford, Mrs. Genevieve Maxwell, and W.J. Darnell Jr., which was Miss Gwen Coley's father. So W.J. Darnell Sr. was the grandfather of Miss Gwen Coley. And some of my classmates was Rosie and Sally Harrell. They were twins. They had a brother, June, and Clementine Hudson. And those were some of my classmates. We had Betty Ford. She was a dear friend of mine. We were always getting into something, and you know how we would pass notes and coach the same boys.
In 1925, the city's first grammar school was constructed. The building was destroyed by fire in 1948. A new building was completed in 1949 and named the Alexander City Junior High School. The first yearbook was called The Mirror and was published in 1928. The first graduating class of Alexander City Colored High School consisted of Daniel Owens, Inez Buckner, Ophelia Moon, and Annie Pearl Cardwell. The first school newspaper of the Alexander City High School was started in 1933, called The Cinder, referring to the railroad where people standing too close might get a cinder in their eye. The Cinder was started by Ralph Frozen and Benny Russell. During the 1940s, the first Alexander City High School band was formed. Planning of a new high school and fundraising to build it was initiated and led by Benny Russell, W.D. Graves, and Dr. Jesse Miller. Funding came from three sources: the Russell Educational and Charitable Foundation, a $100,000 gift from Avondale Mills, and public conscription. The school, which cost over $1 million, was built without any federal money. The new high school was named Benjamin Russell High School and opened in 1950. Laurel High School opened in 1952. Councilwoman Barbara Young served in many positions as an educator, principal of Radney Elementary School, PE teacher, and guidance counselor at Benjamin Russell High School. Throughout the years, she experienced changes in the school system.
Well, beginning in about 1967, I think, 67 or 68, we had a limited type of integration of the races. Some of the Laurel students who wanted to come into Benjamin Russell were permitted to come. Some of our white teachers were assigned to Laurel, which was a black school. So we had what we called choice at that time, limited integration as a kind of the forefront of beginning full integration. And then in 1970, the board, and it was a very fine board, the Board of Education, determined that we should fully integrate our schools. So Avondale School, which had been primarily a school for the Avondale employees' children, Russell School, which was primarily for Russell employees' children, became system-wide schools. We had Avondale, or Jim Pearson, became the first and second grade. This was before we had kindergartens. Laurel School at that time, which is now Stevens, became third and fourth. Russell School, which is now Radney School, was the fifth and sixth. And then our junior high school was 7 through 9, and Benjamin Russell then was 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. And that continued until we put in the kindergarten at Jim Pearson, and then we moved our 9th grade from what we now call the middle school into the high school.
For many students, lifelong memories and friendships were made at homecoming games and on prom nights and senior trips.
Well, I'll have to say my first year is kind of like your first love. I remember my first senior class. My first senior class included people like Laura Oliver, who later became my secretary at Radney School, Fred Dobbs, Jerry Allen. You know, I kind of date myself with these. And my experience with them as my first senior class, I can remember when we had to raise money, and my first thought, being an athlete, was to have a girls' football game, because I thought certainly that would pull in a lot of people, kind of a comedy. But Coach Hamp Line, who was athletic director at that time, nixed that. Instead, he encouraged us to have a fashion show. So we had people like Bobby Dark, Fred Dobbs, who had a knowledge of electronics at that time. So they set up our lighting and our staging, and we did have a fashion show. Ralph Rosen was in that class, and we made a tremendous amount of money. I chaperoned the senior trip to Washington. That was quite an experience, and I think I saw a lot of lifetime friendships develop from that. We tried to give them all the experiences possible. We went to Annapolis and had a lot of good trips with our high school students. We went through the short skirts, the mini skirts, and because I was a 9th grade counselor for the girls, it was not the whole grade, it was just for the girls, I was given the job of measuring skirts. Now, if you can imagine, and of course we've been through this since then, as you're well aware, but at this time the skirts were coming right on up, and it was quite a change in what we had been doing. And so Barbara Young was given the job of measuring, and I always had my measuring stick. This was required of me, and we found that, and the students finally realized, if you had on a miniskirt and white stockings, it looked shorter than if you had on a miniskirt and black stockings. So they had that little way of getting around it. But then, and we met with the merchants in town. You know, this affected the whole town. We met with the merchants. In fact, they gave us a fashion show to show us what was coming in, you know, so that we would not be a backwards community. And we did the famous 3 inches above the top of the knee. That was the line, 3 inches above the top of the knee.
The Alexander City State Junior College opened in 1963 in an old Russell Hospital building on Lee Street with 442 students enrolled. Byron Causey, who was at that time serving as principal of Benjamin Russell High School, became the college's first president on February 1st, 1965. At age 37, he was one of the youngest of junior college presidents. In 1966, the college moved to the old Alex City Country Club site, its present location. In 1988, the college became known as the Central Alabama Community College. Since its founding, the college has played a pivotal role in providing quality academic and athletic opportunities for students. The Central Alabama Community College golf team won the national title in 1997. CACC Trojan baseball players Blake Allen and Keith Long, both former Benjamin Russell High School pitchers, were drafted in Major League Baseball's amateur draft. The Texas Rangers chose Blake Allen in the 37th round, and Keith Long was picked in the 45th round by the Toronto Blue Jays. The Pittsburgh Pirates chose Bill White, another former Benjamin Russell High School athlete, in the 33rd round. Other Benjamin Russell High School graduates went on to become accomplished athletes. All-American Jimmy Red Phillips played with the Auburn Tigers. He went on to play professional football, and in 1985, Phillips was elected to the Alabama Sports Hall of Fame. Roberta Allison Baumgardner was the first woman to sign an athletic scholarship at the University of Alabama. She was inducted into the Alabama Sports Hall of Fame. Vaunt Will Jenkins became the first black player on the girls' tennis team at Benjamin Russell in 1968. She was also the first black player to participate in the state tennis tournament. She was inducted into the University of Louisville Sports Hall of Fame in 1997.
And I go back to the teams that we had. We had our tennis teams. Of course, my first several years, I was a very successful coach because I had Roberta Russell, who was Roberta Baumgardner, her father Cal Allison, who was a coach at that time, and of course they came into the program already playing tennis, but it always makes the coach look good. We played in the first state high school girls tournament in Montevallo. I remember that first tournament and taking the first girls there. And from some of these teams, they went on to play in college. Of course, Roberta certainly did. I had as one of my first black athletes, Vine Twill Jenkins, who has just been interviewed by Laura Dan here for the Outlook just recently. She was on the tennis team, and it was not easy for Vine Twill. That was integration's in the first throes of integration, and we played many teams that were not in favor of the black athlete at that time. But Vine Twill Jenkins persisted and became quite an athlete, and then later went to Louisville in basketball. She was also a basketball player, but because we did not have girls basketball at that time, she didn't have her opportunities here. But I have followed these girls, many of the girls who were active in the athletics as well as other phases of the program have been very successful, and some have even gone on to be PE teachers themselves. Nancy Coley, Nancy Prather Coley was one of my students, so I have seen a number of them going into the teaching field.
Henry Starnes never lost a wrestling match at Benjamin Russell. Under Coach Charles Lee, Starnes helped lead the Wildcats to the first 3 of their 14 state titles. While Starnes was at Auburn, the Tigers won the Southeastern Intercollegiate Wrestling League 3 times. Starnes qualified for the Nationals in the 1963-64 season. Charles Lee was inducted into the Alabama Sports Hall of Fame on March 18, 1995. As head wrestling coach, Lee led the Benjamin Russell team to 11 straight state titles. Dwight Busby wrestled for Coach Lee and later became the Wildcats head wrestling coach from 1979 to 1985. Under Coach Busby, the Wildcats won 3 more state titles.
We had wrestling cheerleaders, and our first year that we had wrestling cheerleaders, and if you remember now, we had about 14 years of a championship wrestling team at Benjamin Russell under Charles Lee, and we were the first group to have cheerleaders, and people kind of made fun of us that first year because we sat there and yelled. About 2 or 3 years later, every other team had wrestling cheerleaders.
Austell Hamilton led the Laurel High School Hornets to the 1962 state basketball championship. After leaving Alexander City to coach at St. Jude, Hamilton in 1968 coached in and won the first integrated football game played in Montgomery. The next year, he and his assistant coach were the first black men to coach in an integrated North-South prep all-star game. Cooper Recreation Center, located on what was the Laurel High School campus, is named after Alfred Cooper. Cooper was inducted into the Alabama A&M University Athletic Hall of Fame in 1997. He was a 4-year starter for the 1948 through 1951 Alabama A&M football teams. Willie Carl Martin played for Coach Hamilton in his final year at Laurel High School. Martin signed a professional football contract with the Edmonton Eskimos of the Canadian Football League. He was on 4 national championship teams with the Eskimos and was drafted by the Houston Oilers of the NFL in 1973. In 1969, Martin turned down Bear Bryant's request that he become the first black football player at the University of Alabama. Benjamin Russell High School graduated Louis Vesey. He lettered all 4 years in football at the University of Alabama from 1952 to 1955. Linwood Strickland, linebacker and tight end for Benjamin Russell in 1957 to 1961, played on Bear Bryant's first national championship team at the University of Alabama. Nathaniel Poole and Terrell Owens, both graduates of Benjamin Russell, played professional football. Poole played with the Denver Broncos and Cincinnati Bengals, and Owens played for the San Francisco 49ers.
When I came, we were maroon and white, and then Hamp Line, who was our athletic director and a very, very close friend, and probably one of the most influential people in my professional life with me. Hamp was quite a character, and had worked with students for so long, and he was an Alabama fan. He played at Alabama under, well, he played with the Bear Bryant. I don't remember who he played under, but he and Bear Bryant played on the same team. So gradually we noticed that each time he ordered uniforms that they were a little bit redder. until finally we came to the place where we had red and white uniforms instead of maroon and white. And of course that's changed since then. I think it's more of a maroon and gray.
The coming of the railroad and its impact on the life and economy of Alexander City was paralleled with the coming of the textile industry. At the turn of the century, the Alexander City cotton mill was in operation, soon to be followed by Russell Mills and Avondale Mills.
The first mill that came to town was the Alexander City Cotton Mills, and they built, in essence, a mill village for their employees, which did have the housing as well as churches and schools and other services that would be available for their employees. In 1902, the Russell Mill complex came to Alexander City and did the same sort of thing, creating a mill village for their employees. And through the years, through the Depression in the 30s, through World War II, they kept strong and kept producing.
Starting to work at the age of 8, Benjamin Russell swept out a furniture store at 4:30 in the morning. An enterprising young man, he worked at various jobs as he attended school. Graduating from the University of Virginia in 1899, he opened a law office in Birmingham and married Roberta Alston McDonald. Ben and Roberta returned to Alexander City in 1900. During this time, Ben heard of a knitting mill for sale in Washington, Georgia. Roberta used money from an inheritance to finance the purchase. The equipment was moved to Alexander City and was installed in a wooden building located on a hill of rock beside a deep ravine. The plant began operations with 8 small knitting machines and a daily capacity of 150 garments. From this humble beginning, Russell Mills expanded into separate mills through which a bale of cotton went through a complete process of being spun, knitted, woven, bleached, dyed, and made into a garment for sale. 4 children were born to Benjamin and Roberta Russell, who each made individual contributions to the development of the textile industry and to Alexander City. Benjamin Commander Russell, Thomas D. Russell, Robert Russell, and Elizabeth Russell. Many significant contributions have been made by the Russell family and Russell Corporation over the years, beginning in 1917, when a church was built to be used alternately by the Methodists and the Baptists. A school was built to meet the educational needs of children kindergarten age through junior high.
The Russell family, particularly Mr. Ben Russell, the founder, he made the greatest contributions. He made this town a city instead of a little whistle stop on the railroad. He tried his best to make for Alex City everything in other little towns did. And he built up pride among us all for being in Alexander City. We were proud of our town, and he was proud of it.
Mr. Billy Radney told the role played by Ben Russell in the growth and development of the town.
This city is a great old city, and you'll have to say that, like our country, George Washington is the fault of it. Well, you really have to say Ben Russell is the fault of Alexander City. He graduated in law from the University of Virginia and came to Birmingham and practiced for 2 or 3 years and didn't like the law business. So he came home and he built Alexander City. He literally built Alexander City. I remember the Carlisle Drug Company across the street from my furniture store was just one room. In fact, the Carlisle brothers went in business in a sandwich shop where the barber shop is now. Then they moved across the street and opened a drugstore because Mr. Ben Russell asked them to, and he sent them to pharmacy school. And he told them, you go on, I'll take care of your business while you're gone. And he did. And they came back, and that's how Carlisle Drug Company came into being.
Avondale Mills acquired the Alexander City Cotton Mill in 1919. and turned operations over to J. Fletcher Comer, son of Braxton Bragg Comer, governor of Alabama from 1907 until 1911. Braxton Bragg Comer III recalled the establishing of Avondale Mills in Alexander City and why the city was chosen as the site for the mill.
The plant that they started here, they named after one of the governor's daughters, who was named Bovell, and that's where the name Bovell came from. The name Eva Jane, which is many have heard, was the name of the plant in Sylacauga, and it was the governor's wife. I'm referring to my great-grandfather as the governor. That's how he became known by after he was later governor of the state of Alabama. Well, one of the things that they looked for anytime you're going to have a textile mill is you want good workers and people who can run the plant, because textile plants were very labor intensive at the turn of the century, and the community of Alexander City was one that had both a growing population and also a very good work ethic. And that was one of the things that they were very excited about when they located a plant here in Alexander City.
Concerned about quality in all areas of business and community, the Comer family established schools and churches.
One of the things that is very important in any community is to have an educated workforce. And of course, it's very hard to believe, but at that point in time that there were no schools in the state. You may have heard about someone going to live with someone in order to get an education. And so that was one of the reasons why the mill was very involved in starting schools, of course, not only here in Alexander City, but also in Pale City and in Sylacauga. And then also at the same time, they knew how important churches were, and worked to establish both the Methodist and the Baptist church in the area. One of the things that I think that of course made it very important here in the Alexander City community was the fact that when B.B. Comer, who became governor in 1907 to 1911, his son Donald Comer became president of the Avondale Mills, and John Fletcher Comer, or better known as Fletcher Comer, was the plant manager here in Alexander City. And Fletcher Comer and my grandfather, who was Braxton Bragg Jr., were very close and very much involved in making sure that the quality and production of the cloth was done as good as possible.
In 1928, Mr. John Fletcher Comer organized 2 ball teams as a form of recreation for the mill employees. One was all white, the Millers, the other all black, the Avondale Black Crackers. Teams the Black Crackers played included the Birmingham Black Barons, Opelika Blue Jays, and the Cleveland Buckeyes. Willie Mays was one of the young players on an opposing team, the Black Barons. Alexander City was blessed with strong leadership in all aspects of community life, not just in business and education, but in the medical community as well. Early doctors struggled to treat diseases with limited medical resources. Not until the 1930s did Alexander City doctors such as J.A. Chapman, W.E. Maxwell, T.H. Street, and A.L. Harlan have antibiotics to fight diseases of the day. An early incident of open-heart surgery performed by Dr. T.H. Street was described in medical textbooks of the time.
This man fell and had an axe in his hand, and the axe went down between his ribs and nicked the front of his heart. And Dr. Street opened up his chest and sewed up his heart. And that was written up in a textbook that was
occurred when I was in medical school by Dr. DaCosta. DaCosta's textbook of surgery describes Dr. Street's operating on the man's heart.
Dr. Street served as the company doctor when gold mining resumed at Hog Mountain.
Hog Mountain gold mine was in full bloom when I came here, and Dr. Street was our regular doctor, but he wasn't in very good health, and he used to get me to go up there to see the people up there, and they worked a couple of hundred people up there at Hog Mountain Gold Mine in those days. They had one level at 200 feet and one at 300 feet, and they had a lot of people living around that area. And occasionally one of them would get hurt down in the mine, and I'd have to go down there and see about him.
Patients were often treated at home. Alexander City's first infirmary hospital, named Dr. J.A. Goggins Infirmary, was located in a house. The house, a large two-story frame structure, was built in the Queen Anne style with a wraparound front and back porch. It was built in 1895 for the residence of Dr. Andrew Jackson Coley, one of the first surgeons to locate in the city. Later, the house was purchased by Dr. Goggin. Known as the Coley Joyner House, this historic home was placed on the Alabama Register of Landmarks and Heritage on March 30th, 1989, and the National Register of Historic Places on January 3rd, 1991. The house has been completely restored by Ed and Ellen Joyner and is furnished throughout with priceless antiques. Russell Hospital opened in 1923 with 35 beds, limited surgical equipment, and a nurses training program. In 1965, the old hospital was replaced by the modern structure on what is now the 280 highway. Elizabeth Russell Allison and James W. Brown Jr. played key roles in the development of Russell Hospital.
When I came here in 1935, the hospital was well established, and there was never any question about who was running the hospital, who was boss out there at all. That was Mr. Ben's hospital. And if I had a patient that I wanted to put in the hospital and the man didn't have any money, I called Mr. Ben, number one, on the telephone, and he answered the phone personally, did not have to go through a lot of other hands. And I told him that Joe Jackson had a hernia, and he had a house full of children, and I thought it'd be expedient if we put him in the hospital and operated on him and got him where he was able to go to work. He wasn't in condition to work. And Mr. Ben would say, yeah, I agree with you thoroughly. I'll pay the hospital bill. If you'll operate on him free, I'll certainly put up with him in the hospital. And so we went ahead and got the thing done.
Dr. Andrew Jackson Coley served the community well as a physician and as a politician. Dr. Coley was mayor of Alexander City in 1902 and 1903. Alexander City's first mayor was Ross Barton, followed by B.L. Dean, R.N. Parker, J.J. Bailey, S.P. Adams Sr., E.L. Goggins, S.J. Nolan, A.J. Coley, A.P. Fuquay, W.M. Welsh, J.L. Thornton, Thomas C. Russell, W.V. Morgan, Jack Williams, Joe H. Robinson, I.I. Fox, W.L. Radney Jr., Hugh Thompson, Jack Bush, Charles Bailey, Ben Cleveland, and Don McClelland. These mayors played a significant role in the community's progress. R.N. Parker, mayor from 1882 to 1886, was the first editor of the Alexander City Outlook, working with publisher T.S. Christian. The Outlook was preceded by The Beacon, edited and published by A.P. Longshore, and in 1887, The Vidette, edited by John F. Williamson. In 1891, W.R. Whatley and T.S. Christian founded the Weekly Dispatch. The Alexander City Outlook became firmly rooted but changed management over the years. J.C. Henderson became editor and publisher in February of 1944. He had many experiences in the 53 years of association with the newspaper.
Well, at that time, we were printing around 60 pages a week of course, we only had twice a week publication, and we had it on Tuesday and Wednesday, two issues a week. And we also had a section of women's news, and we had about 6 pages every week for nothing but women's news. We had a lady editor that was really good, and she got all the weddings and all the bridge clubs and everything like that. We had newsboys to go out to Russell Mills at 4 o'clock at the deadline, and we'd sell at least 600 or 700 papers at one time. We had the newsboys. We had a circulation of 7,500 in 1972.
The story of the Lady in the Lake was one of the most sensational news stories published by the Outlook during J.C. Henderson's journalistic career.
Well, it was this lady she was missed by her people, and it seemed that she picked up a hitchhiker, a woman, by the way, and she disappeared. And later, her body came up down at Lake Hills, and that gave the story Lady in the Lake. And they saw Floyd Mann, who was on the police force at that particular time, solved the case by questioning the woman that killed the lady. And so they convicted her of murder.
Alexander City's first radio station, WRFS, started broadcasting on May 31st, 1947. At 12:45, Monday through Saturday, people tuned into WRFS to hear the familiar voice of Mrs. Louise Day with Daily Doings.
Well, I had been feeling so good when the last of the Russian satellites burned out. I thought how lucky we are. The air is clear, and we just have our 3 satellites in the air. But the day before yesterday, Russia launched the largest satellite we've had yet, weighs almost 2 tons. You know, there have been 5 satellites put in the air, and Russia, it looks like she can put them in larger and bigger and quicker and faster than we can. Sputnik number 2, you remember, burned out on April the 14th, so Moscow announced. And they never did find any trace of it. And America has 3 artificial moons in the air. And then when Russia put in this other one, why, she has one now, so there are 4. I told somebody it made me feel uneasy to think of 2 tons whirling around above our heads, and they laughed and said, well, it'd burn up before it ever got down here, Miss Day, don't worry. But I was right interested in noticing one thing. Sputnik number 2, that was launched with the dog in it on November the 3rd, went around the world 2,370 times, and it covered about 62,500,000 miles. And I heard last night that this 2-ton satellite goes around the world in about 1 hour and 6 minutes. My me, what wonderful things we face.
Every day at noon, she went to the radio station. And she talked and she talked and she talked. And she always went over time, and they'd try to stop her. And she said, wait a minute, I'm not through. And she's gone over time as much as 10 minutes, them trying to get her off. She said, wait a minute, I'm not finished. I got to tell them about this. She was a sight.
Martin Dam was completed in 1926 by the Alabama Power Company. The damming of the Tallapoosa River formed Lake Martin with a shoreline of more than 700 miles. In the 70 years that followed, Lake Martin developed, offering many resources for residents and visitors.
We decided that to have a big Thomas Martin Day. As you know, Tom Martin was the president of the Alabama Power Company. And he came down here, and we, after much persuasion, he agreed to come to Ellick City and let us eulogize him and publicize him. And he told us, told Robert and me, that he'd never been asked or shown any recognition for what he'd done for the state. And he's done a great deal. That's where we live, is on the lake, and that's the only one named after him.
The Children's Harbor, located on Lake Martin, was founded in 1991 by Ben and Lou Ann Russell. Services are provided to children with chronic illnesses, such as cancer and sickle cell disease. Counseling services are provided to in-residence teens and their families. The Children's Harbor Lighthouse has become a well-known landmark. Other landmarks on Lake Martin include Goat Island and Snake Island. Goat Island was named for its inhabitants, and Snake Island was named because of its overgrown appearance. Chimney Rock and Acapulco Rock were named for their rock ledges. Graveyard Island was named for the old graves. Kalijah is a name made famous by a Hank Williams song by the same name, and written at Darwin Dobbs Lake Home a few months prior to Williams' death.
The Kalijah was real popular then. In fact, to sort of push the thing along, the Watley boys went up here to Sylacauga and borrowed that Indian chief that was down here at the river on Kalijah, at the bridge, at that restaurant down there. And we sort of pointed with pride and tied it in with the Hank Williams Day. And Hank's wife came. She brought the little boy who's now Hank Jr.
I built the first pontoon boat on Lake Martin, and it was 12 foot wide and 20 foot long, and I went to Montgomery and got some disposable airplane gas tanks at a junkyard down there, and I think I paid probably $20 a piece for them, and attached them to a frame that a couple of fellows helped me build, and we built it and put a 5 horsepower motor on it, and got some pipe and built a railing around it. And I can remember at night we would get a piano and put on it and go around and do lots of singing down there late at night. Mary Ann Hardy, the one time in particular I can think about, she'd play the piano, and Mary Ann Hardy, but one of the great singers of all time was Dr. J.J. Walls, and Dr. Walls would lead us in singing down there, but a friend of mine, he lived down there close to, and Tom Ogletree from Sylacauga, he was from here. He and I grew up together, and he had a place on the lake, and well, I can remember Tom Redney, my brother, my wife, Sam and Virginia Bradshaw. A lot of us get out and just have big time down on the lake at night.
From the wooden Indian Kalijah, who overlooks the lake, to the humming motorboats and waves lapping against the shore, to the fountain in downtown Alexander City, landmarks of the past remain. Customs survive. The stories of heritage and tradition told by members of the Carlisle Drugstore Coffee Club and other local folk scan the 125-year period since the town's incorporation and provide inspiration and vision for the future.